Today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about South Sudan and the Lutheran ministry that's happening in South Sudan. But before we get to South Sudan, we need to do some talking about some other places, like America. My ancestors came from Germany, and I think a lot of other ancestors of people here in Minnesota came from other European nations, from all over the place. My great-grandparents were the ones that came. So you don't have to go back that many generations, just a few generations. And I know for many of you, it's likely the same. You don't have to go back that many generations to get back to a different country. But the people who came over here to America, they came for a lot of reasons. A lot of them came to avoid war. There were some wars devastating Europe, and so they came to get away from it. Or they came to avoid being drafted in it. Or some of them came because they were hungry, because there were too many people on the land, and they could no longer support themselves. So they gave everything up that they had, traveled halfway around the world to start something new. You don't do that if everything's going really well. And so when people came here, they did what people always have done. They found people like themselves. So when the Norwegians came, they found other Norwegians. When the Swedes came, they found other Swedes. They formed communities, they formed towns, and they lived together. They spoke their native tongues, they kept some of their native languages, and in the midst of all of that, they started churches. They started churches that remembered the old ways, the ways that they had worshipped back home, the ways that they had shared in faith. And they worshipped in native language, Norwegian, Swedish, German. And some of these churches worshipped in those languages for many, many years. If you go to an older generation, they talk about how they went to confirmation and had to learn the Swedish language or Norwegian to figure out what was going on in confirmation. It was a common story. But eventually, the generations were assimilated into American culture. The children and the grandchildren of those immigrants truly were Americanized. And so they wanted to worship in English. They wanted to do everything in English because this was home. But in the midst of that, they still remembered the old traditions. In some churches, we still have things like lutefisk dinners because they're remembering the heritage, they're remembering the days when their ancestors came. That same story is happening today. And that same story has happened in the last decade. But the immigrants aren't coming from Northern Europe anymore. These immigrants we're talking about today came from Sudan and South Sudan. A lot of people don't know where Sudan is on a map, and there's a handout that I have available that makes this possible. If you look at the handout, you can see where in Africa Sudan is. It is directly south of Egypt. And Sudan was one of these countries that was formed when the European nations got together and kind of carved up Africa. Problem was they didn't ask the Africans who they wanted to be with. So we put these borders around groups of people who really had never gotten along. And then we expected them to somehow figure out how to form a government. It didn't work very well. And especially didn't work very well in Sudan. In the northern areas of the nation of Sudan, you have people of Arab descent who came from the Middle East by and large. They religiously, by and large, were Islamic. They were Muslim. And the northern Sudan is an arid desert. You go down to southern Sudan, and the whole story is completely different. The people of southern Sudan were of African descent. By and large, they were Christian. Southern Sudan is not arid. It's very fertile, lots of cropland, great land for grazing cattle. Things were good down there. But southern Sudan also, as an African nation, or as an African area of African descent, had lots of people from different tribes. A very tribal culture where people will identify with tribe before they will identify with nation. The challenge that happened between the northern portion and the southern portion of Sudan for many, many years after their forming was there was war. Because these two groups could not get along. And it got even worse when oil was discovered in southern Sudan. Because what you had in the north, in Khartoum, the capital, it was run by the people of Arab descent. They did not like the Africans. They wanted what the Africans had in the oil. They wanted to benefit from that. And they wanted to impose Islamic law on the entire nation. But the people of the South wanted no part of that. They were Christian. And they said, you can't make us do that. And so war started. For a number of years, the war actually was going on between the tribes because the government in Khartoum was wonderful at arming tribe against tribe. But over time, those tribes came together and said, wait a minute, we have a common purpose here. We would like to be our own nation. We would like not to have to deal with the government of Khartoum. And so open warfare, a civil war went on for decades. In the midst of that civil war, over 2 million people died. Think about that. 2 million people. How do you wrap your mind around that? Well, in the state of Minnesota, there are about 5.4 million people. In the Twin Cities metro area, there are 3.4 million people. So if you were to take every man, woman, and child outside the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area in the state of Minnesota and have them all die, that's the scale we're talking about. Everybody in Rochester, Mankato, Duluth, St. Cloud, Alexandria, Bemidji, all of them. That's the scale of death that we're talking about. It was in the midst of this war the people fled. The people fled to get away from the open fighting. Common McQueer, who's one of our leaders at one of the churches in Rochester, he talks about the fact that he was in worship and the whole worship service was machine gunned. They talk about how people ran away to get out of the village, to get into the bush, to hide so they didn't get shot. If you stayed in town and got shot, you would stay in town, you would get shot. If you went to the countryside, you'd probably get malaria. So which do you want? To get shot or have malaria? These aren't good options. So people fled. They walked many, many miles, and many people died on these journeys as they went to refugee camps in Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia. And as they got there, life was hard. There was not much food. But the food they did have, a lot of it came from Lutheran World Relief. The blankets that they received, they would ask, who gave us these blankets? Where did these come from? And they were told from Lutheran women in the United States. Times were hard in those refugee camps, but they came together and they formed worshiping communities. They gathered under a tree. They didn't have fancy worship buildings. They went to trees and went under them and they worshiped God and they prayed for something better. And something better came. For some of them, they were sent to America to start a new life. And so their story became the very same story that my ancestors lived. They came to America in many different places. But then they found other people who spoke their language, who had their customs. They came to places like Owatonna, places like Faribault, places like Austin or Rochester. And as they came together, they formed churches. They formed churches where they could worship in their own native tongue, where they could worship in their own style, where they could be their own people, where they could pass on their culture just like my ancestors did. And when they came, they found jobs, they got resettled, they had kids, they started getting a part of the community. Now back home, they were by and large Presbyterian or Episcopal or maybe Catholic, because Sudan originally was a British protectorate. That was their area, and so it was their churches, the British churches, that were formed there. Until recently, there was no Lutheran Church of South Sudan. But that's changing. In 2011, the political situation in Sudan changed completely. Because of a peace process that was implemented, the people of South Sudan had the option of voting whether they wanted to be their own nation or whether they wanted to be a part of Sudan, whether they wanted to remain. And overwhelmingly, they voted to become their own nation. So in 2011, South Sudan became the newest country in the world. They split away from Sudan. They had their own government. Juba is the capital of South Sudan. And they got things started. And it started with hope, with excitement, with dancing, with singing, that we are all going to be great because we have our own nation now. It was in the midst of this moment of peace that the people who had come here to America started traveling home, partly to visit family. But when they would go home, they would realize that there were no churches, that there weren't any priests or pastors anywhere in the area. So they would raise up people and say, hey, let's get you some training. You can start this community. So Lutheran churches started because people from Lutheran churches in America went to South Sudan and started what they knew. Pastor Wal Reed is a great example of that. Pastor Wal was in Faribault. He's of the Nuer tribe. He was in Faribault with the worshiping community there for a number of years, and while he was there, went to seminary, got his training, and became a Lutheran pastor of the ELCA. But in the midst of all of that, he had gone home several times, and when he was there, he would find the communities without pastors. He would gather people together. He would appoint an evangelist. He would get that evangelist training. And they became a church. But they became a church tied to America, tied to an American church, tied to our Saviors in Faribault, tied to the southeastern Minnesota Synod of the ELCA. So when these lay evangelists were trained and commissioned, they were commissioned as lay evangelists of this synod. The problem was that we had all kinds of places around this country sending people back home, starting churches. And all the churches in South Sudan had relationships in America, but not with each other. So a few years ago, the move was made to say, what would it look like to bring the churches of South Sudan together to be their own South Sudanese Lutheran church, that make their own decisions, to control their own future, to discern what God is doing in their midst. So a couple of years ago, I was on a task force that was supposed to go over and call people from around South Sudan and begin that process. But the problem was the Civil War had started again. This time the Civil War wasn't with the North in Sudan. This time the Civil War was among the tribes and among the power brokers of South Sudan. In some ways it's no different than the story that happened in the Balkans a number of years ago, because the people of the Balkans had come together to fight the communists. And once the communists are gone, they looked at each other and realized that they had centuries of not liking each other. And so then the warfare went from we're together against the communists to we really don't get along ourselves. Similar things happened in South Sudan. They came together to fight against the Arabs of Khartoum. But once they had their own nation, it started fighting among themselves. And that fighting is still going on. That story is not over, and we continue to pray for peace in South Sudan. In the midst of that warfare, as many groups are leaving South Sudan, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is going in. And we're going in with both feet. Because in Juba, we are building a Lutheran center. We are building a place, a symbolic place where people of all tribes can come and worship. But it's more than just a place of worship and a place of church administration. It will be a place of education, so women and girls can get vocational training. It will be a place of health care, where people in that area of Juba can have some kind of doctor, some nurse to see. In that area of Juba, there are absolutely no options for health care, none. This will give hope. Pastor Wal Reed from Faribault is no longer in Faribault. He has gone back to South Sudan. He is serving God at the ELCA as a missionary, especially among the refugee camps in Ethiopia, where many of the people that he had relationships with have fled because of the outbreak and fighting again. So we in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America are working with the people on the ground in South Sudan to start a new church, a new Lutheran body, something new and exciting in the midst of warfare, in the midst of killing, to say God is more powerful than this. The big difference between the work that is going on in Africa now and what happened generations ago, it used to be that the Europeans brought Christianity to Africa and had to convert the heathen, if you will, is how that was seen. What's happening now is South Sudanese brothers and sisters of faith are going home to their own brothers and sisters of faith and saying, let's get some churches going. People are hungry to hear the gospel, and we get to be a part of all of that. We in the Southeastern Minnesota Synod actually are a major part of raising money for not only Pastor Wall and the missionary work that he's doing, but also for this building that's going up in Juba, which is going to change the situation on the ground. People will have health care. People will learn. People will worship because of what we're doing. Because God has worked among Lutherans in America, whether they have light skin or dark skin, whether they have European ancestry or South Sudanese ancestry. God has called all of us together to do God's work here in America, among the worshiping communities we have in Austin and Otana and Rochester, but also to work in South Sudan, to make a difference in God's world, and to bring hope and peace to a land ravaged with war. South Sudan is at the heart of our ministry, not because it's those people over there, but because it's the brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers of people who are right here in southeastern Minnesota, right here in our own congregations, worshiping with us, sometimes in English, sometimes in Anuak, sometimes in Dinka, sometimes in Nuer, different languages, different tribes. But we have one God, and we're excited to serve that God as we serve South Sudan.